Imagine walking into your own office, only to be accused of trespassing. A woman dressed in her finest professional attire is suddenly treated like a criminal. Her only crime? Existing in a place where they assume she doesn't belong. But what happens when they realize the huge mistake they've just made? Let us know in the comments if you've ever been underestimated. Then stay tuned for this unbelievable story. The courthouse was already alive with its usual chaos. Judges in black robes moving briskly through corridors, public defenders juggling case files, anxious families waiting outside courtrooms, and bailiffs keeping order in the halls. The smell of freshly brewed coffee clashed with the faint scent of musty old legal books, and the distant hum of conversations created an ever-present white noise. Simone Harper, dressed in a navy blue power suit, strode through the entrance of City Hall with confidence. Her heels clacked against the polished marble floors, echoing with authority. A leather briefcase hung from her right hand, the other adjusting the gold watch on her wrist. Every inch of her presence commanded respect. Yet, as she walked toward the prosecutor's office, she felt it, that stare. The kind that burned into your skin before anyone even said a word. The court clerk at the front desk, an older woman with sharp, scrutinizing eyes and a stiff gray bob, sat behind a computer, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. She was staring at Simone like she was something out of place. Simone offered a polite smile. "Good morning. The clerk's frown deepened, and her hand hovered toward the intercom. "Excuse me, ma'am, this area isn't open to the public." Simone blinked. "Public?" "And not the public," she said, with an easy confidence, reaching into her briefcase. "I'm Simone Harper. I'm here for my first day." The woman barely glanced at the ID Simone slid across the desk. Instead, she let out a sharp breath through her nose and glanced over at security, a burly officer stationed near the entrance. "Sir, we have a situation," the clerk called, her voice carrying a sharp authority that made heads turn. Simone's brows furrowed. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even stepped out of line. "What situation?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "I just introduced myself. I'm the new—" The officer approached, his boots heavy on the floor. He scanned Simone from head to toe, taking in her dark complexion, her perfect posture, the confidence in her eyes. And yet, his hand instinctively hovered near his radio. "We're gonna need you to step back, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped. Simone inhaled sharply. This wasn't happening. "Step back." She adjusted her briefcase, tilting her chin up slightly. "Step back from where? My own office?" The clerk made a sound of disbelief, shaking her head. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you can't just walk in here and pretend." "Pretend what?" Simone challenged, heat rising in her voice. The officer took another step closer, hand now fully resting on his radio. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." Simone felt a tightness in her chest, the slow simmer of frustration turning to something hotter. "I will not lower my voice. I have every right to be here," she said, her posture unwavering. Other staff members were beginning to glance over, whispers bouncing between them like echoes in a canyon. A younger court clerk, a timid-looking man in wire-frame glasses, tapped at his keyboard and hesitated. His eyes darted from the screen to Simone. Ms. Reynolds, I think there might be—" The older clerk, Reynolds, shot him a warning look. Simone noticed it immediately. She saw the hesitation, the silent struggle in his face. He knew. "I'd like to speak to the district attorney," Simone said firmly. "Oh, that won't be necessary," Reynolds scoffed. "Security will escort you out." That was the final straw. Simone dropped her briefcase onto the counter with a loud thud, making Reynolds flinch. Then she leaned in, her voice like steel. "You call security on me, and the only thing you'll be doing for the next hour is writing an apology letter," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Better yet, why don't we speed things up? Let's walk into the DA's office right now. Let's see who's mistaken." For a split second, silence wrapped around the room like a vice. The younger clerk hesitated, his fingers typing rapidly. Then his eyes flickered back up. "Oh," his voice was barely above a whisper. He looked at Reynolds. I just checked. She's actually—" The color drained from Reynolds's face. The security officer frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Wait. What?" Simone straightened, arching a brow. "Go on. Say it." The young clerk swallowed thickly. "She's the new city prosecutor." A single beat passed. Then another. Then chaos. Reynolds jerked back from the desk as if she had touched fire. The security officer took a hard step away, adjusting his belt awkwardly, the tension in his shoulders now replaced with something close to embarrassment. The courthouse staff, who had been watching, suddenly looked anywhere but at Simone. Simone let out a slow, measured breath. "Now," she said smoothly, lifting her briefcase from the counter. "If we're done playing interrogate the black woman in a courthouse, I'd love to get to my office." She walked forward, her steps slow and deliberate. Neither Reynolds nor the security officer moved to stop her. By the time she reached the door leading to the prosecutor's offices, a new hush had settled in the lobby. The kind of hush that came when everyone realized they had just made a very, very big mistake. "And Simone?" She smirked. "Because this was only the beginning." The tension in the courthouse had not faded. If anything, it had thickened, clinging to the walls like humidity before a storm. Every set of eyes that had witnessed the debacle in the lobby now carried a different weight when they landed on Simone. Some averted their gaze, others openly gawked, and a select few, like Reynolds, still clung to their own arrogance, though noticeably subdued. Simone walked into her office and shut the door with controlled force. The moment it clicked shut, she took a deep breath. Not today, she told herself. They don't get to ruin today. The office was modest but respectable. A large wooden desk sat in the center, neatly arranged with a computer, stacks of case files, and a small placard with her name, City Prosecutor, Simone Harper, gleaming in gold letters. She traced her fingers over it. They had been so quick to dismiss her, yet here was her name, as undeniable as the title it held. Before she could settle in, a sharp knock rattled her door. "Come in," she called, keeping her voice steady. The door swung open to reveal District Attorney Michael Carrington, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stepped inside with an unreadable expression, hands in his pockets. "Well," he said, letting out a breath. "That was quite the entrance." Simone leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "Wasn't exactly the grand welcome I was expecting." Carrington studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I heard what happened." "Did you?" she said coolly. "Because I don't think hearing it does it justice." He ran a hand over his face. "Simone, listen." "No," she cut in, pushing off the desk. "You listen. I walked into my office today and was nearly arrested because some court clerk decided I didn't look the part. I had to stand there and be treated like an outsider in a building I've spent years working to be in. And for what? Because someone like me in this position is still a foreign concept to them?" Carrington exhaled, his gaze steady. "You're right. It was completely unacceptable. And I want you to know that it's being handled." Simone scoffed. "Handled? How, exactly? A slap on the wrist? A strongly worded email?" "I've already spoken to Reynolds," he said. "She's being put on a 2-week unpaid suspension." Simone let out a dry laugh. 2 weeks? That woman accused me of trespassing. She tried to have me arrested. And her punishment is a paid vacation minus a paycheck? Carrington's jaw tightened. "I understand why you're angry." "No, Michael. You don't," Simone said, her voice sharp. "You might sympathize, but you don't understand, because I bet you've never had to prove over and over again that you belong in the very place you earned a right to be." The room fell into silence, thick with unspoken truths. Carrington sighed. Look, Simone, I get that this is personal. It's not personal, she cut in, stepping closer. It's systemic. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words pressing down. You want her fired? Simone hesitated. She wanted accountability, but she also knew how these systems worked. Fire one clerk and they'd just replace her with another who thought the same way. That wasn't the victory she needed. I want something bigger, she said finally. Carrington raised an eyebrow. Bigger? I want mandatory anti-bias training for every employee in this building, clerks, bailiffs, assistants, even judges. I want policies in place so that this doesn't happen to the next black woman who walks through these doors. Carrington was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right. Simone blinked. All right. I'll push it through, he said. It won't happen overnight, but if you want policy changes, I'll back you up. She studied him carefully, looking for insincerity but found none. Good, she said, her voice firm. Because I'm not going anywhere. Carrington smirked. I didn't think you were. As he turned to leave, he paused. And, for the record, you're going to do great here. Don't let today make you forget that. She didn't reply, but something in her posture softened. When he was gone, she finally took a seat at her desk, exhaling slowly. A few moments later, her office phone rang. This is Simone Harper, she answered. A hesitant voice came through the line. Ms. Harper, this is Caleb Ford, one of the assistant clerks. She recognized the voice. The younger clerk, the one who had hesitated before checking her name in the system. What can I do for you, Mr. Ford? She asked, keeping her tone neutral. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said quickly, for what happened earlier. I should have spoken up sooner. Simone tilted her head. Why didn't you? A pause. Then, quieter, because I was scared of Reynolds. Of the whole system, he admitted. She's been here for over 20 years. People like her, they run this place. He sighed. I saw what was happening, and I knew it wasn't right. But I froze, and I hate that I did. Simone let his words settle. You have a choice, Mr. Ford, she said. You can let that fear keep you silent, or you can use it to push you forward, because next time, someone else is going to need you to speak up. Another pause. Then, quietly, I understand. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Good. As she hung up the phone, she let out a slow breath. She had made it through her first day. But the real fight? It was just getting started. The news traveled fast. By the time Simone stepped into the courthouse the next morning, there was a noticeable shift in the air. Conversations halted as she walked by, eyes darting away or lingering just a moment too long. The hush that followed her was different from the wary skepticism of yesterday. This was something else. Awareness. She wasn't an unknown anymore. The woman they had dismissed as an intruder was now the woman in charge. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase and strode toward her office with the same unshakable confidence she had carried the day before, only now there was something sharper in her step. Let them whisper. Let them sit in their discomfort. They were about to learn something new today. As she neared the clerk's desk, Reynolds was notably absent. In her place sat Caleb Ford, the young assistant clerk who had called her the night before. He looked up when she approached, his face already flushed with nerves. Max Harper, he greeted, clearing his throat. Good morning. She stopped in front of the desk. Good morning, Mr. Ford. You're covering today? He nodded quickly. Reynolds is, on her suspension. Simone arched an eyebrow. I see. There was a pause. Then, as if bracing himself, Caleb leaned in slightly. Just so you know, people are talking about what happened yesterday. Some are upset, some are embarrassed, and some, he hesitated, well, some don't think you should have made a big deal out of it." Simone exhaled through her nose. "Is that so?" Caleb nodded. "They're saying it was a misunderstanding, that you could have just clarified before it escalated." Simone let out a dry laugh. "Because it was my responsibility to make them believe I belonged?" Caleb winced. "I don't agree with them, if that helps." It didn't, but at least he was honest. Simone tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something, Mr. Ford. If a white man in a suit had walked through those doors yesterday, do you think Reynolds would have questioned him?" He opened his mouth, but then his shoulders slumped. He didn't have to answer. They both knew the truth. Simone gave a small nod. "Exactly." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She walked past him and into her office, closing the door behind her. The day had barely started. 2 hours later, she was in a meeting with the senior staff of the prosecutor's office. A long wooden conference table stretched the room, lined with attorneys, legal assistants, and administrative staff. District Attorney Michael Carrington sat at the head of the table, his expression neutral but observant. Simone sat across from him, her fingers laced together on the polished surface. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her. Some were curious, others skeptical, and then there were the ones who clearly resented her presence. She smiled at them. Carrington cleared his throat. "All right, let's get started. We have several case reviews to go over, but before that, I believe Ms. Harper has something she'd like to address." Simone didn't hesitate. She pushed back her chair slightly, letting her gaze sweep over the room. "As most of you already know, my first day here didn't exactly start on a high note," she said, her voice smooth but unwavering. "And if we're being honest, it wasn't just an incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Let's call it what it is," she continued. "Bias. A very specific kind of bias that makes some people believe they have the authority to decide who does and doesn't belong in a space, even when the facts say otherwise." A silence settled in the room. "Now, I've already spoken to the district attorney about implementing mandatory anti-bias training for everyone in this courthouse, not just the clerks, not just security, everyone." A man across the table scoffed. "Is this really necessary?" Simone turned her gaze on him. His name was Peter Walsh, one of the senior prosecutors, a man who had been with the office for over 2 decades and carried himself as if that tenure alone made him untouchable. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We're lawyers. We deal in facts, not feelings. A training like this just—" He shook his head. "It's excessive." Simone smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Excessive," she repeated. "Tell me, Mr. Walsh, have you ever been stopped in your own workplace and asked to prove you belong?" He frowned. "That's not the—" "Have you ever had security approach you in a building where your name is on the door, questioning whether you should be there?" He shifted in his seat. "Look, I understand what happened was—" "No," Simone interrupted. "You don't understand. And that's exactly why this training is necessary." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, low but present. Walsh clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue further. Simone leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear. This is not optional. We cannot demand fairness in the courtroom while allowing bias to fester in the very offices that uphold the law." Carrington, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He simply nodded. "I agree, and this training is happening. Anyone who has an issue with that can take it up with me." Walsh didn't respond. Neither did anyone else. Simone straightened in her chair. "Good." The meeting continued with case discussions, but the energy in the room had shifted. By the time it ended, Simone felt something settle in her chest. Not relief. Not yet. But momentum. As she walked back to her office, she spotted Caleb Ford standing outside, seemingly waiting for her. She raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" He swallowed, then nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to say that what you said in there, that mattered." Simone tilted her head. Why do I feel like there's a but coming? Caleb let out a nervous chuckle. Because there is. He hesitated. This place? It's not going to change overnight. Some of these people, they don't want to change. Simone nodded slowly. I know. He exhaled. So? What now? She considered his question. Then she smiled. Now, she said, we make it impossible for them to ignore. And with that, she stepped into her office, closing the door behind her. The reckoning had only just begun. Simone sat at her desk, the weight of the last few days pressing against her shoulders. The courthouse had been a battlefield, and she had spent every moment since her first day proving she belonged, proving what should have already been obvious. But something was different now. The whispers had quieted. The stares weren't as blatant. And today, as she walked through the hallways, something subtle but powerful happened. People stepped aside, not out of fear, not out of dismissal, out of respect. It wasn't universal, not yet. There were still those who held their resentment like a shield, unwilling to acknowledge what had taken place. But the shift had begun, and momentum was on her side. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Come in, she called. The door creaked open, and to her surprise, Caleb Ford stepped inside. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a small group of courthouse staff, a few clerks, a paralegal, even a couple of attorneys. Simone blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Caleb cleared his throat. We just wanted to say something. Simone set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. All right. He hesitated, glancing at the others. Then he took a deep breath. The way you stood up to all of this, he shook his head. It wasn't just about you. It was about all of us who've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like we weren't enough. Simone's brows lifted slightly, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. Another clerk, a woman named Denise, stepped forward. Reynolds treated a lot of us like garbage, she admitted, but we just dealt with it, because that's how it's always been. A younger paralegal nodded. People like us? We don't make waves here, we keep our heads down. But you didn't. Caleb's voice softened. You made them look. You made them listen. Simone took in the sight before her. These weren't just colleagues. These were people who had been waiting for someone to shake the foundation of the system they worked in. People who had learned to survive in silence but were now, finally, speaking. She exhaled slowly. You don't have to keep your heads down anymore. Denise smiled. That's what we're counting on. The group lingered for a moment longer, and then, one by one, they left. Caleb was the last to go, offering her a small nod before closing the door behind him. Simone sat still, staring at the door. She had expected pushback, resistance. She had braced herself for battle, knowing she was stepping into a fight that had been brewing long before she arrived. What she hadn't expected was the shift, not just in the courthouse, in them. Another knock sounded, sharper this time. Enter, she called. Michael Carrington walked in, carrying a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes. I take it you've seen what's happening out there? He asked, setting the folder on her desk. Simone smirked, hard to miss. Carrington sighed and shook his head, a small, almost reluctant smile forming. You really don't know how to ease into things, do you? Nope. He chuckled, then gestured to the folder. That's the finalized training proposal. I already sent it through. Judges are signing off on it, and it should be implemented by next quarter. Simone opened the folder, scanning the document. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't fix everything overnight. But it was a start. She closed the folder and met his gaze. Thank you. Carrington nodded. I meant what I said before. You're going to do great here. She studied him for a moment before speaking. We'll see. He smirked. We will. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing. Simone arched an eyebrow. Yes? I had a very interesting conversation with Reynolds this morning. Simone tilted her head. Did you? Carrington nodded. She's, considering early retirement. Simone's lips twitched. Interesting? Very. They held each other's gaze for a beat before Carrington shook his head with a quiet chuckle. Welcome to the courthouse, Miss Harper. With that, he walked out, leaving her alone with the weight of what had just transpired. Simone let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting to the nameplate on her desk. City prosecutor. The title they had tried to deny her. The title that now carried more power than ever before. She had won this battle. But the war, the real war, that was just beginning, and she was ready.